or vice versa. There's some implication, again, that everybody jumps to the conclusion that an intimate poison them or kill them or use witchcraft against them. So there's something to that. But my interpretation is a little bit different. I'll come to it a little later, which is the way marriage systems work in this part of Tanzania. Women move to live with their husbands. So there's what's called patrilocal marital exogamy. I don't know why anthropologists use this term, but patrilocal means living with on the sort of male side of the family, marital exogamy, marrying outside of your group. So in that case, women tend to move into their husbands' communities. They don't have their network of siblings and cousins and others in the village. It's their husband's network that's there. Once he's gone, they tend to be more vulnerable than they might have been beforehand. I'll come back to why that may matter. Yes. Okay, so there was an attempt actually to do just that. There were a couple of attempts in the colonial period to crack down on witchcraft practices, which were resisted in many parts of East Africa. In the 1970s, during the peak of the socialist period in Tanzania, where they were trying to organize these model villages and do all kinds of reforms, there was a very brief attempt to crack down on this by really trying to arrest and charge the people who killed the old women. And there was such a huge backlash against that that basically the authorities stopped trying to do anything. So there actually have been attempts by the central government. There are plenty of people in the central government who don't like this, who view it as something that's illegal, that's wrong, that's unfair. And I think some people who are a little bit more cosmopolitan may frankly be kind of embarrassed by this. If you Google Tanzania witches, you'll find a lot of news coverage and whatnot of all these witch killings in Tanzania. But when the central government's tried to crack down, it hasn't worked. And part of it is a lot of the local authorities just won't go ahead and crack down. You have to bring in outside police, basically. These local village councils have responsibility for law and order. So if they're not on board, a prosecution won't go anywhere. Martin? Yeah, that's the interpretation that I'm going to give to a lot of the data, is basically the resource scarcity story. Let me give you this quote, and then we'll get to exactly this interpretation in the next slide. So here's just a quote to give you guys a sense. Misaki is a Tanzanian social scientist who's written a lot about this. This is a quote of a woman who was attacked for being a witch, or you'll see almost attacked for being a witch. So actually, because she was never physically attacked, she wouldn't even show up in our data. There could be lots of cases like this woman that we never even captured in our data because she ran away before. So let me read it to you. I ran away from Rusule in Shinyanga district. Shinyanga district borders Meatu. It's the same region, Sukuma ethnically dominated. After being suspected of being a witch. There were many deaths in the family, so it was sort of health problems. Then the rumor began to spread in the village that I was the one who killed them. So this gets back to the point before about suspicion. My own children started to hate me. Some of them started taunting me as a witch. Okay, so that's a bad sign in this part of the world. When your own family members are calling you a witch, not good. I tried to explain, but they did not give me the chance to vindicate myself. Because, of course, there's no way to vindicate yourself. How can you prove you're not something? I knew what would befall me in view of what had happened to others previously, for they were brutally killed. Thus, when one of the grandchildren whispered to me they were about to kill me, I left the same evening. I've lived in this camp for 3 years now, and though I love my family, there's no way of going back to face certain death. So in Shinyanga district, which is the capital of the region, Shinyanga region, there's a kind of medium-sized city, Shinyanga town. There are actually small communities of these like refugee or exiled witches, women who are accused of being witches that are helped by a few local NGOs who help take care of them. So there's enough of them that there's actually NGOs that deal with this problem. Okay, so and I'll come back to another case in a sec, but let me get to the resource scarcity issue. So one interpretation of what's going on has to do with the fact, again, this is such an extremely poor area, and these are very poor households. It turns out anthropologists have written about the issue of what they call death-hastening activities. That's a euphemism. Where in a third of all societies, anthropologists have cataloged hundreds and hundreds of human civilizations. In a third of those societies, from all over the world, they find very clear evidence of death-hastening activities directed at either the elderly or the very young. Okay, that's kind of a hint already that the issue of economic productivity may be part of the story, because those are probably the two least productive groups. Here's a quote about the Inuit in the Arctic. When resources were meager with the Amazigh Inuit, the decrepit elderly, when perceived as a burden on the community, were placed on an ice floe and pushed out to sea to die. That was just an established practice, and according to some of the anthropological evidence, some of the elderly willingly did this when they were late in their life, because resources were so scarce that they didn't want to eat food that would keep others alive. The same sort of logic could apply to young children. If you kind of do the math the same way, they're not very productive. Now, the difference would be young children will grow to be productive, so they're kind of, net present value in terms of economic productivity, fertility, et cetera, is much higher than very sick old folks. So that's a distinction. There are examples of this in Northern Europe, in Iceland, in North America, in Asia, in Australia, in addition to African cases. So anthropologists have documented stunningly similar activities that in poor communities, in resource-scarce years, the elderly are killed off or driven away. I've heard a story, it wasn't in some of the anthropologists I read, but several students over the years have made a comment in class that there's a kind of tradition or this kind of folk tradition in Japan that in famine years, the elderly are asked to walk up a mountain to die to sort of safeguard the rest of the community. Now, I haven't read that documentation, like 4 or 5 people said, oh, we've heard this kind of folk story, that that's what old people used to do in difficult years. So this is going to be an economic model. It's really a toy model, just a set of ideas that formalize some of these points. Why would it be the case that the elderly would be driven away or the less productive would be driven away in certain years? So just imagine a simple model with n household members, 5, 10, however many household members. And imagine there's 2 types of years. There's good rainfall years, and then there's drought years, bad years. In drought years, in this part of Tanzania, this dry part of Tanzania, crops don't grow very well. There's very little food. Okay, what's the second part of the model? The second part is consumption. If we make a very simple assumption, let's assume people need to consume at least some value of consumption. Imagine caloric consumption, C star, in terms to live. That's going to deliver the result that we want. So just to trace this out, imagine that my probability of survival, this is my probability that I survive this year, is some function of my consumption. Now you would expect that, and now we're not going to get to extreme levels of consumption, like eating 10,000 calories a day, supersize me, whatever, not that kind of consumption. Like in the reasonable range of consumption, we would expect this would be upward sloping, right? The more I eat, the more likely I am to survive. If I'm really malnourished, I'm going to get sick and die. Well, there's a view that actually there could be a very sharp piece of this relationship, a very steep slope at some point. And there's some physiological evidence for this. That basically there's some kind of minimum level of calories that I need, really just to keep my heart beating and my brain working. So you can reduce caloric consumption a lot, and you'll have less and less energy, you'll be able to move around less and less, but there's a certain number of calories, maybe it's 1,100 a day, 1,200 a day or something, that you just need to keep your systems functioning. And if you fall below that amount for more than a few days or maybe a couple weeks, your body just starts shutting down. So this is what C star could be thought of, just the minimum calories you need to live to maintain what's called basal metabolism. Basal metabolism is the metabolism needed, or the calorie burning needed just to sustain basic systems with no additional activity. In the most extreme version of this, it would be some kind of step function. It would just look like this. And of course, it's not literally that perfect, but there's some element of some steepness right around C star. Okay. If we live in this kind of world, good years and bad years look very different. In good years, let's imagine there's enough to eat. There's n household members, and our income is large enough that we can purchase consumption C star for all the household members. Everybody can live. But imagine in bad years, in this poor part of Tanzania, among these poor households, in this semi-arid area, imagine this condition holds. Now what do we do? The simplest way to divide up food within the household is to do it really non-strategically, right? We just have a pot of food, we all share equally, and in a good rainfall year where y equals y high, that's fine, everybody lives. What happens if we're in the y low case, and we all share income, we all share food equally? Under the strict version before, we would all die. If we believe that step function, now all of us are at risk of dying. The whole household will be wiped out. So if the household objective function is for some of us to live, some of us to continue going on and keeping the family together, you actually might need unequal division of food. And if we're trying to survive in the future and have enough income to live the next period, it would be pretty reasonable to target food to the most productive folks. Keep them alive so they can actually earn income when income-generating opportunities emerge. So this incredibly simple way of looking at the world generates discriminatory targeting away from maybe the very young and the very old, but particularly away from the very old. Any comments or questions? Now you might ask yourself, why do there have to be killings of this kind? Yeah, go ahead. In our data, we did not collect data on disability. So we don't know if, say, it wasn't just older, poor women who were targeted, but old, poor, disabled women. We don't know that. We didn't collect that data. According to this kind of model, it would be a very reasonable hypothesis to test, if that was the case. Okay, so what we want to do in the data, we collected this data, we went around, is compare what happens in these good or bad years, high income and low income years. The idea being in the low income years, do you actually see more of this going on? There may be some reasons why there is murder rather than just, let me put it this way. In addition to the witch murders may be the tip of the iceberg in some sense. There may be some other households where these older women or older men in some cases are given less food, where they do die because they aren't given health care or food or other scarce household resources, but we don't record them in our data. They weren't a crime. Maybe what we're recording is just the most spectacular, visible cases. So that's another possibility here. What we're going to test is whether we see an increase in witch killing in bad years, extreme drought, extreme flooding years that are associated with big drops in income. That's going to be the main test of this paper. There's you can see the original version of this paper on my website. The chapter in Economic Gangsters summarizes this in some detail. If you actually want to see the regression tables, you can get the main paper. I'm going to show you a bunch of the regression tables. I mentioned savings on this slide. How would access to finance change things here? Yeah. So if there was access to credit in really bad years, people could take out loans to survive. If people could get crop insurance, et cetera. But this is an area with a very limited financial sector. And going back to the Udry example, if there's a drought that hits a whole village, you sort of have nowhere to turn here, or very few places to turn. Okay. So let's get to a clicker question. There's actually an interesting pattern in the data, and I want to get your guys' take on it. It turns out when we look at the data, and we see the effect of disease epidemics at the village, there's much less of an effect of a local disease epidemic. So for instance, there are cholera outbreaks in this district, there are measles outbreaks in this district. It's just a very bad health environment. So there's a lot of these health epidemics. We don't see a rise in witch killing. So what are some explanations? A, could it be the case that local religious beliefs don't tie witchcraft to health? B, is the analysis just uninformative for some statistical reason? C, do disease epidemics not affect local economic conditions? Or D, is it just really too hard to know given what I've told you so far? So those are the options. Yeah. So it's an interesting point. Most of the disease epidemics strike young kids. So most of the measles outbreaks and cholera outbreaks tend to strike young kids, although others could also be affected, but just keep that in mind. Okay, maybe another 10, 15 seconds. Please talk to your neighbor if you find it useful. Okay, so pretty interesting. Most of you said C, disease epidemics don't affect local economic conditions. Some of you said, well, maybe religious beliefs aren't linked, traditional witchcraft beliefs are not linked to health, but they are. They're very strongly linked with health, like in the quote I gave you before. B was the standard errors. I'll show you the standards. They're okay. They're not very tight, but they're kind of moderate. But we will show that disease epidemics do not correlate with local economic conditions. So this is probably a more reasonable explanation of what's going on. Okay, so here's a table from the original paper. And I hope you guys, can you make out the numbers? Okay, kind of? Okay. So what you can see in column 1, and there's only some limited data here because we only got good income data while we were surveying. We couldn't get retrospective data. But what you can see is in these extreme drought or flood years, measured per capita consumption, so basically living standards fall a lot. That's a drop of like 20 to 25% in average income. That is a huge shock. In a drought year, average incomes fall 20 to 25%. In the US Great Recession, average incomes fell 3%, and it was like a huge calamity. This is a much, much bigger economic shock. But if you look in column 2, in years of human disease epidemics, there's really no effect on local economic conditions. Yeah. Yeah, so since so many kids are the ones dying here, they're not producing that much. And in fact, in a perverse way, if there's a reduction in local population in an epidemic, the epidemics don't usually kill enough people to really affect local population, but even if they did, and they killed unproductive kids, if anything, they raise per capita income. So basically, there's just no relationship between disease epidemics and local economic conditions, but extreme rainfall has a big negative effect. And in particular, we also asked about famine years, years where people were really, really short on food, where they had to maybe rely on food aid. Sometimes people had to walk many kilometers to close by towns where there were sort of food aid distribution areas. And again, basically, these drought and flood years are famine years. Not exactly one-to-one, but almost. There's a huge correlation there. That's the kind of channel. We should think of these extreme rainfall years as big economic shocks. What we find out is in extreme rainfall years, and this is the main finding of the paper, there are large increases in witch murders and attacks. So even though there's some witch murders and attacks throughout for various idiosyncratic reasons, there's a big concentration of them in drought and flood years. You see these spikes in witch killing. Yeah. 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 When we went to the village committee, the VC, and the village authorities, we asked them a whole range of questions about local public finance issues, for different projects, and then we had a section on crime, and we just tried to catalog, okay, year by year, let's think of murders that affected the village, and then was there, if there was a murder, was it a witch murder or not? And there was never any debate about that. It was like, oh yeah, everybody knew that was a witch murder. So we just classified it the way people there locally classify it. We didn't sort of make that categorization ourselves. It was just when we talked to the village government officials, they said, there were witch murders and non-witch murders. A lot of the non-witch murders are related to either cattle raids or just personal disputes, lovers' quarrels, and those normal murders. And then there were witch murders, and these were sort of a distinct enough category that the government officials were very confident about what was a witch murder. So, yeah, go ahead. In our setting, there were no kids attacked or killed as witches. I'll talk about some other settings, other African settings, where there have been witch attacks against children. So actually, in terms of the logic of this model, in several war zones, civil war zones, there have been these epidemics of killings of children by their own parents. Again, it's always within the family. Children accused, 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds accused of being witches. So that does happen elsewhere, but it doesn't happen in our data. It was only the elderly in our data. Okay. There was no impact on non-witch murders, on these lovers' quarrel murders, or cattle theft-related murders. There was no link there. Another pattern that's interesting is there was more reaction in terms of witch murders in these drought years, in these bad rainfall years, in the villages that had a higher proportion of followers of traditional religions. So there's some variation in that across the area. There were some areas with lots of Christians and Muslims, other areas with almost all traditional religious adherents, and it was in those areas with very strong traditional religious beliefs where you have the strongest reaction. So there's some notion here that economic conditions really matter. I mean, I think that's one of the punchlines of the analysis, but there is a cultural dimension too. So in areas where people believe that much more strongly in traditional witchcraft beliefs, they react that much more against these old women. So that's one interpretation. Can anybody think of an alternative interpretation for why you would see more of these witch murders in areas with traditional religious beliefs? Yeah. Oh, you're saying when there is bad rainfall, it sort of strengthens people's belief in the traditional beliefs. Yeah. I see. So they want to have some sort of explanation for it. That's interesting. I haven't run that analysis. I've never regressed share of traditional religious belief on, say, lags of bad rainfall, which is how you could get at what you said. I haven't done that in data. That's really interesting. Yeah. Exactly. So there is a correlation. The more traditional believers there are, those villages do tend to be more isolated. They do tend to be poorer. Now, we can control for some of those factors, but you might think that our controls are imperfect. It's back to omitted variables. That even if we're controlling partially for that socioeconomic variation, if the areas with lots of traditional believers are unobservably poor in ways we don't measure, maybe this is still just a poverty effect. That these are like the poorest, most isolated areas. So that's another interpretation that we can't really distinguish too well, but it's another way of thinking about the data. Okay, so here's one of the main findings. Here, the outcome is the number of witch murders. And the main explanatory variable is extreme rainfall, drought, or flood. And you can see there's an increase, a pretty substantial increase in these extreme rainfall years. Remember, the mean of the outcome of the dependent variable is 0.09. What that means is, in any given year in a village, there's a 9% risk that there'll be a witch murder. In an extreme rainfall year, that goes up by 0.085. It almost doubles. So there's this huge increase in the risk of witch killing, almost a doubling in the bad years. So that is telling us this is pretty important. And one of the things that's interesting, and I already alluded to this finding, is if in column 4 here, we also control for whether there was a disease epidemic, you'll see that there's no relationship between disease epidemic and the witch murders. It's just like a zero effect. So again, remember, disease epidemics don't affect economic conditions, but they are something people traditionally believe witches can control. So it's not enough to think witches are doing it. It has to be something you think witches are doing in your traditional belief that's also making people much worse off. That seems to be the key driver of things here. Okay, so people believe that witches can both affect the weather and they can affect health. So you might think when there's a bad health outcome, like a disease epidemic, they would go and say, a kid in his family died, I'm going to kill the grandmother. She did it, she's a witch. We know witches are the ones that cause these things. But they don't. People in this area also believe that witches cause bad weather and they cause your crops to fail and whatnot. In that case, they do kill grandma. But that's a case where people are desperate and poor and they don't have enough to eat. So it's not, I can't definitively prove that there's an economic channel, but this is evidence in favor of that view, sort of broadly consistent with that view of the world. Does that make sense? There's also something different where a drought will typically affect everybody, so maybe there is a different social dynamic. That's one possibility. Of course, more broadly, even beyond this distinction, you may just ask yourself, even if we are desperate, even if it is an economic channel, why are we killing this woman? Why don't we just sort of send her away and hope she survives and then she can come back or something like that? That isn't what happens too much in this area. In southern Tanzania, there's another region of southern Tanzania where there's a lot of witchcraft belief and a lot of witch attacks and those kinds of things. But in recent years, there have actually been fewer witch killings and witch attacks. And there's actually this great book by an anthropologist called, I think her name's Maya Green. And she wrote a book about witch attacks and witchcraft in southern Tanzania. And it turns out there were some traditional healers that set up what you could think of as a camp or a community. They bought property where they welcomed witches. So these traditional healers claimed that they could cleanse witches. So even if you thought someone was a witch, these traditional healers could purify them. They had all these purifications.